Since we've just looked at the cell membrane and we know that its job is to control what enters and leaves the cell, we're now going to take a look at our last two videos will be about how things move in and out of the cell. Now there are two different ways that items can move. One of them is called passive transport. And passive transport is when the item, the chemical, whatever it is, moves across the cell membrane, but your cell does not have to use any energy. So it just naturally moves across the cell membrane. No extra energy is added. So, for example, if this is your cell membrane right here, and this is, the inside of the cell, the outside of the cell, there's the little openings that we know material can move in and out. Again, we have the semi-permeable membrane. This says that over time, you don't even have to add any energy. Naturally, particles want to be even on both sides. So if you would count the number of particles that you have here and the number that you have here, they should be the same. And that is part of passive transport when no energy is required to do that. Now specifically the picture that I'm showing you here is of diffusion. Diffusion says that it's a molecule. It could be any molecule other than water, because water has its own unique name. So it could be you're moving a sugar molecule or a salt molecule. Anything that you're trying to move across says that it will naturally spread out and evenly distribute itself so that the numbers are the same on both sides. The concentration on the inside and outside of the cell are equal to each other. And here's a picture of diffusion. If you were to spray something, some really strong perfume or cologne in the hallway, you would have a very concentrated amount right where you sprayed it. And eventually over time, maybe someone at the very end of your hallway is going to be able to smell whatever you sprayed. And the reason for that is those particles move in the air, and they naturally go from where you sprayed them, so where it's highly concentrated, and they're naturally going to move away from that point, and they're going to spread out all along this area. So people in the middle of the hallway, into the hallway, eventually everybody is going to be able to smell that. So when we talk about diffusion, substances will diffuse. They're going to move wherever their high concentration is. That's kind of their starting point. And they're going to move to where there's less concentration of those particles. So at the end of the hallway, when you first sprayed it, there were 0 particles down here. And over time, you're going to have this blue box. You would have these green dots evenly spaced all throughout, and that would be diffusion. No energy is required for this. Your cell just naturally, certain particles can move in and out of the cell freely, and so there's no energy. There's nothing that your cell has to do. It just naturally happens. Now when I said that they're going to move until they're equal, the word that we're referring to is called equilibrium, and this just says that the concentrations are equal on both sides, and by both sides we're referring to inside and outside the cell. So we're looking at the inside of the cell versus the outside of the cell, and the concentration inside is equal to the concentration outside. Now we said osmosis had, the movement of water had its own word, and that is osmosis. A lot of people refer to Osmosis Jones. It's a cartoon movie that came out that talks about osmosis. But this is the movement of water specifically. So we're not talking about sugar, we're not talking about salt. We are only looking at how water moves across our membrane. And again, it's selectively permeable. Because osmosis is an example of passive transport doesn't require any energy. The water is going to go from where the high concentration is, and it's going to move to the low side. So it will always go from high to low with its passive transport, and no energy required. Again, that's part of the definition of passive transport. Now there are 3 different ways or types, I guess, of osmosis, and it depends on which way the water is moving. So in this picture here, you notice that there's a yellow arrow going in and a green arrow coming out. And the cell really kind of looks like it's maintaining its shape. Red blood cells kind of have that little dimple in the middle, or little indent. And isotonic is what we refer to when the water is moving in and out equally. So maybe 5 water molecules are coming in, well, 5 water molecules are going out. And so the amount of water that's being transported is equal, what's going in is equal to what's coming out. So that's isotonic. We also have what's referred to as hypertonic, and this means that there's more water inside of the cell than outside. So I want you to think about that for just a second, because we said water moves from a high concentration to a low. So if there's more water inside of the cell, that must mean that there's less water outside. So if you think about which way water will move, let's take a look at our picture. So we just said that there's more water inside of the cell. Red on red probably isn't very helpful. So there's more water inside of this cell, and there's less water outside. And so you notice the arrow is only coming out. Okay, trying to make it equal. You have the extra water that's inside coming out to try to balance these. Eventually you want it to become isotonic. You want it to be where the water is moving back and forth equally. But for right now it's not balanced. It's not at equilibrium. So the water is going to come out, and this smaller water side is going to slowly increase, and the inside of the cell is going to slowly decrease, and eventually they'll be equal to each other. And then the water will go back and forth equally. But hypertonic, the water is going to leave the cell, it's going to lose water, the cell will shrivel up, it will look dehydrated. So hypertonic is when your cells are losing water, so there's definitely a dehydration issue there. And the last one is hypotonic, and this is the reverse. Hypotonic means that there's more water on the outside of the cell, and the inside of the cell is the low side. So again, water goes from high to low. So if you're high on the outside and you're low inside, then the water's going to move inside. It's going to move toward the low side. And notice that this picture, you don't even see that dimple anymore. It looks very, very big, bloated. So in a hypotonic situation, the water's going to enter the cell faster than what it's leaving because it's trying to reach equilibrium. And depending on what the difference is, then it could be that just a little bit of water needs to move. But if you have a very high concentration difference and a lot of water has to move, then you're looking at possibly the cells bursting. And it mentions it there. You can see a picture of even a cell. It's kind of exploded and the water's kind of being exploded out. So if enough of your cells were to do that, were to burst because of, they get so filled up with water that they pop, that causes the cell to die. And if enough cells do that, then it wouldn't be good for that particular organ or organ system. You'd probably be in pretty bad shape. So those are the 3 different types of osmosis. The last type of passive transport that we need to look at is called facilitated diffusion. And this is still diffusion. Okay, diffusion just means that the particles, and again, we're not talking about water right now because it's not osmosis. So salt, sugar, food, anything else. If it diffuses, if it moves across the cell membrane with help, here's the facilitated part. When you have a facilitator, that's someone who's trying to help move the process along. So facilitated diffusion is going to be using these proteins that we have embedded in our cell membrane. We talked about those in the previous video. If they get help from a protein in order to move inside or to go outside, then it's just referred to as facilitated diffusion. If this particle can travel right through the cell membrane without the help of the protein, then that's just plain old diffusion. But because it is getting help from this protein, that means it's called facilitated. And it could be getting help from one of those channeled proteins that allow the road to allow the particle a way to travel in and out. And there are some particles that are big enough that they can't just travel through the cell membrane. Some of them can. They can just go right through the lipid layer and go right on inside. But many of them cannot, and they need help from a protein, and so that would be facilitated diffusion.